The distress call had been weak, barely more than a whisper against the cosmic void, a desperate plea from a dying world, ignored by every major power in the galaxy. The message was simple. We are under attack. Our cities burn. Our people fall. Please, help us. No one came. The Arathax Dominion had invaded without mercy. A brutal race of conquerors, they swept through the defenseless world like a storm of fire and steel. Their warships hovered over cities, raining down destruction. Their soldiers marched through the streets, executing any who dared resist. The planet, once known as Valen IV, was doomed to be just another name erased from the star charts, its people enslaved or exterminated. The Galactic Council heard the call and did nothing. They muttered about diplomatic complications, about non-interference treaties, about acceptable casualties. They would not risk war with the Arathax for a world that held no strategic value. And so, the galaxy turned its back. But they had forgotten something. Valen IV was not just any world, it was a human colony, and humanity never let its own fall. The attack fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. 500 warships, a force that should not have existed. The Council had believed humanity was weak, fractured, unable to muster such a force. But they had underestimated them. The fleet's flagship, Indomitable, a monstrous dreadnought bristling with weaponry, led the charge. At its helm stood Admiral Elias Vance, his expression carved from stone, his voice calm as he issued the order that would change everything. Begin orbital bombardment. Let them feel what it's like to be on the receiving end. The skies of Valen IV erupted in fire. The Arathax had never feared humanity. They had seen them as upstarts, primitive and reckless, more suited for dying in the fringes of space than waging war against an empire. They were wrong. Humanity had spent centuries fighting among themselves, perfecting the art of war in a way no other species had. The Council had outlawed mass planetary invasions, had discouraged total war. Humanity had ignored those rules. They had built ships for a fight they had hoped would never come, but had prepared for anyway. And now that preparation was paying off. The Indomitable's rail cannons roared, sending slugs the size of buildings into the Arathax capital ships, tearing through shields and armor like paper. Human corvettes swarmed enemy formations, weaving between their lumbering ships and gutting them with precision strikes. Drop pods rained down like falling stars, each one carrying soldiers clad in exosuits, their armor designed to withstand the worst the galaxy had to offer. They landed in the streets of burning cities, and did not stop. The Arathax expected them to be slow, to be burdened by their heavier armor. Instead, they moved like demons, striking fast and hard, pushing through enemy lines with relentless efficiency. Humanity fought like a species that had spent its entire existence waging war. The battle raged for hours. By the time the last Arathax warship tried to flee, it was too late. Humanity had surrounded them, leaving no escape. Admiral Vance watched as the enemy flagship burned in the void, its hull breaking apart. He did not smile. There was no joy in war, only duty. The people of Valen IV had been abandoned, left to die, but not by humanity, never by humanity. Because when one of their own cried out for help, humanity answered. And they came with fire. The aftermath of the battle left the skies above Valen IV littered with wreckage. Burned-out husks of Arathax warships drifted in the void, their shattered remains a grim testament to humanity's response. On the ground, the fires still smoldered, buildings reduced to rubble, bodies, both human and Arathax, scattered like discarded dolls. Admiral Elias Vance stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, staring at the ruined landscape below. His fists clenched at his sides. Victory had come, but at a cost. Thousands of colonists had died before the fleet arrived. Entire cities had been razed. The Arathax had made sure that even in defeat, they left scars. "Admiral," a voice broke his thoughts. It was Captain Layla Monroe, his second in command. "The ground teams are securing the last of the Arathax prisoners. Resistance has ceased." Vance nodded, his face unreadable. "Casualties?" "Heavy, sir, both military and civilian." He exhaled slowly. The cost of war was always blood, but that didn't mean it had to be in vain. "Open a channel to all surviving colonists," Vance ordered. A moment later, his voice was broadcasted across the ruined planet. "This is Admiral Elias Vance of the Terran Defense Fleet. The Arathax are defeated. Your home is yours once more. We came because no one else would, because humanity does not abandon its own. We mourn the dead, but we stand for the living. And to the Arathax," he paused, his voice cold as steel. "You thought no one would come. You were wrong, and you will never forget this day." On the surface, survivors staggered from underground shelters and half-collapsed buildings, their faces dirty, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Some wept. Others simply stared in disbelief at the sight of Terran soldiers patrolling the streets, not as conquerors, but as liberators. A young girl, no older than 10, clutched her mother's hand as she watched a squad of soldiers clear debris from a collapsed school. One of them, his armor scratched and dented from battle, knelt beside her, pulling a ration bar from his pack. "Here, kid," he said gruffly, handing it over. She hesitated, then took it. Are they gone?" The soldier glanced at the sky, where the wreckage of the enemy still burned. "Yeah," he said. "They're gone." For the first time in weeks, she smiled. But humanity's fight wasn't over. In the dark corners of the galaxy, the Arathax Dominion reeled from their unexpected defeat. No one had ever hit them so hard before, had ever made them bleed so badly. And now, their high command sat in stunned silence, watching the footage of their burning fleet, their fallen soldiers. "They weren't supposed to be capable of this," one of the warlords muttered. "They weren't supposed to care," another growled. "The Council ignored the colony. We assumed the humans would too." The Supreme Warlord, a towering figure with coal-black eyes, leaned forward. "Then we assumed wrong." His voice was low, dangerous. "Humanity is not the weak, divided species we thought. They came when no one else did, and they came with fire and vengeance." A silence stretched across the chamber. "Then we must prepare," one of the warlords said. "Because if they did this for a single colony, what will they do if we push them further?" The Supreme Warlord's fingers curled into a fist. "They will come again." His eyes burned with something between fury and admiration. "And this time, we must be ready." The fires of Valen 4 had barely cooled when the first whispers of war began to spread. Across the galaxy, the news of humanity's intervention sent shockwaves through political halls, war councils, and hidden power brokers. No one had expected them to act. No one had believed they had the strength, the will, or the ruthlessness to launch such a decisive strike. But humanity had not only responded, they had annihilated the Arathax invasion force. Inside the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council, an emergency session had been called. Representatives from the major species of the galaxy sat in uneasy silence as footage of the battle over Valen 4 played on the central display. The destruction was absolute. The Arathax fleet, which had been expected to crush the colony with ease, had been torn apart with terrifying efficiency. This is madness," Chancellor Valen of the Zephyr Union muttered, rubbing his scaled brow. "How did they do this?" "They shouldn't have had the numbers, the technology." "They did," a deep voice interrupted. All eyes turned to the Arathax representative, warlord Sithran. His dark eyes burned with barely restrained rage. His species had never suffered such humiliation. "The Terrans were underestimated," Sithran growled. "A mistake that will not be repeated." A murmur of unease spread across the chamber. The Arathak's dominion was one of the most powerful military forces in the known galaxy. If they were planning retaliation, the war that followed could shatter the fragile peace the Council had maintained for centuries. "Let us not be hasty," Councillor Orvis of the Sithari Alliance said carefully. "Perhaps this was an anomaly, a single instance of human aggression provoked by the attack on their colony. We have long known them to be emotional, protective of their own. This does not mean they are a true threat to the balance of power." Sithran's lip curled in disgust. "You are a fool if you believe that," he snapped. "Look at what they did. 500 warships. Soldiers in numbers we did not think they possessed. They crushed us. And when they spoke to the survivors, their admiral made it clear. This was only the beginning." The chamber fell into silence. Then, slowly, a voice spoke from the shadows. "They have been preparing for war." Every head turned as High Speaker Luthen of the Vren coalition stepped forward. The Vren were an ancient species, their people known for their long memories and careful strategies. They had watched humanity more closely than most. "We thought them chaotic," Luthen continued, his eyes narrowing. "Unorganized, too busy fighting among themselves to be a threat. But we were wrong." He gestured toward the screen, where the Indomitable hovered over Valen 4 like a silent guardian. "They are not fractured. They are united. They did not hesitate to act, and they did not ask for permission. This is not the sign of a weak race." A tense silence stretched between the council members. Finally, Chancellor Vilen exhaled sharply. "Then we must ask ourselves a question," he murmured. "One that will determine the future of this galaxy." He looked around the room, eyes heavy with unspoken fear. Are the humans our allies, or our doom? Back on Valen 4, the surviving colonists worked alongside Terran soldiers, rebuilding what had been lost. Admiral Vance stood on the edge of the ruined city, gazing up at the sky, where the Terran fleet still held position. "This won't be the last time we do this," Captain Monroe said beside him. Vance nodded. "Number it won't." She hesitated. "What do you think the Council will do?" He exhaled slowly. "They'll debate, they'll hesitate, they'll lie to themselves, pretend we're still a small, insignificant species." Then, finally, he turned to face her, his expression hard. "But the Arathaks won't wait. They'll come back, stronger, angrier, and this time they won't just target a colony." Monroe swallowed. "Earth." Vance didn't need to answer. They both knew the truth. Valen 4 had been the spark. The fire was coming. The war drums of the Arathak's dominion beat in the darkness of space. From the shattered remnants of their fleet, survivors returned to their home world, carrying a message of humiliation and vengeance. Warlord Zithran stood before the grand conclave of the Dominion, his body still bearing the wounds of Valen 4, his pride bleeding far worse than his flesh. "We were wrong about humanity," he growled, his voice echoing through the war hall. "We thought them weak. We thought they would not come. They did, and they brought with them a fire unlike any we have ever faced." A murmur spread through the warlords gathered before him. The Arathaks prided themselves as conquerors, undefeated for centuries. But now the stars themselves whispered of their failure. A towering figure stepped forward, High Warlord Varzathan, supreme leader of the Dominion. His presence alone was enough to silence the room. He gazed at Zithran, his expression unreadable. "You return in disgrace," Varzathan said, But disgrace is not the same as defeat. Tell me, Warlord, did you learn? Zithron clenched his fists. Yes, High Warlord. He took a slow breath. We underestimated them. Their technology is not as primitive as we believed. Their strategies are not as reckless as we assumed. And worst of all, his jaw tightened. They are not afraid of us. Varzathan remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly he spoke. Good. The room stilled. Fear makes for weak enemies, the High Warlord continued. I would rather face a foe that fights, a foe that bleeds, a foe that makes us stronger. His dark gaze swept over the assembled warlords. But they must understand their place. Humanity has made their move. His voice dropped to a dangerous growl. Now we make ours. Zithron straightened. Then you authorize war? Varzathan smiled, a slow, predatory thing. Not yet. He turned to a nearby holomap, where the sectors of space flickered in brilliant blues and reds. Humanity fights with emotion, he mused. They respond when their own are threatened. So we will not threaten their colonies. We will go for the throat. We will make them fear for the homeworld they protect. The warlords stiffened, understanding dawning in their eyes. Earth. On the far edge of Terran space, Admiral Elias Vance stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching as the first wave of reinforcements arrived. The fleet was growing. Fast. Humanity had been preparing for war long before Valen IV. The moment the Galactic Council abandoned them, the moment the major powers of the galaxy had dismissed them as insignificant, humanity had known this day would come. And so they had built in secret. They had constructed warships under the guise of defensive expansion. They had designed weapons that the rest of the galaxy had never seen. They had trained soldiers for a war that no one believed they could fight. Vance turned to Captain Monroe. Status report. 20 additional warships arrived from the Martian shipyards this morning, she said. We're integrating them into the fleet now. Ground forces are cycling through training rotations. Morale is high. Everyone knows what's coming. Vance nodded. They all felt it. The tension in the air, the quiet before the storm. Humanity had made its move. Now they were waiting for the counterattack, and it would come. You think they'll hit the outer colonies again? Monroe asked. Vance shook his head. No. He exhaled slowly, his eyes dark. If I were them, I'd go straight for Earth. Monroe's expression hardened. Then we need to be ready. Vance turned back to the massive viewport, watching the fleet prepare. They would be ready, because when the Arethax came, humanity would show them what war truly meant. The Arethax invasion fleet moved like a silent storm through the void, its massive warships blotting out the stars as they advanced toward their target. Earth. The Dominion had not sent raiding parties this time. They had not come for resources or colonies on the fringes. They had come to end humanity before they could grow into a true galactic power. High Warlord Varzathan stood aboard the bridge of his flagship, the Eclipse of Dominion, watching as his fleet sailed through the cold expanse of space. His expression was calm, but beneath it burned a hunger for retribution. Time to target? He asked. 3 standard days, one of his officers reported. Human fleet formations detected in the Saul system. They are preparing for war. Varzathan smiled darkly. Let them prepare. This would not be a mere battle. This would be an extermination. Back on Earth, the skies were alive with movement. Massive orbital platforms churned with activity as battleships were loaded with final supplies. Fighters screamed across the sky in tight formations, weaving between towering skyscrapers that had been transformed into last resort defensive positions. Humanity had seen this coming, and they were ready. Admiral Elias Vance stood in the war room beneath the United Terran Command Center in Geneva, surrounded by holographic projections of the incoming Arathax fleet. The enemy was vast, 2,000 warships, countless strike craft, and enough firepower to reduce Earth to dust. The room was tense. High-ranking officers, generals, and political leaders all stood around the table, watching as the red wave of enemy ships closed in. President Alan Graves broke the silence. "What's our best estimate, Admiral?" Vance's voice was steady, but grim. "They outnumber us 3-1. Their ships are larger, more heavily armored, and have greater energy output." A murmur spread through the room. "But they don't have our technology," Vance continued. "They don't have our tactics, and most of all, they don't have our will." Graves nodded slowly. "Then what's the plan?" Vance stepped forward, his eyes locked on the incoming enemy formation. "We draw them in, make them think they're winning." He gestured toward the outer planets of the Saul system. "We feign a desperate defense at Jupiter. We give them blood, but we don't break. When they push forward, we snap the trap shut." A new hologram flickered into existence. Hidden Terran battle groups, concealed on the dark side of the moon, buried beneath Mars' surface, waiting in deep space beyond the system. "When they commit their forces to the final push toward Earth, we cut off their retreat," Vance said, his voice like steel. "We will turn Saul into a graveyard. They will come expecting conquest. They will find annihilation." The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, President Graves nodded. "Then let's give them hell." 3 days later, the Arathax fleet entered the Saul system. And humanity was waiting. The Arathax Armada surged into the Saul system like a tidal wave of death. The vastness of their fleet was a sight the galaxy had rarely seen. 2,000 warships, countless support craft, and planetary bombardment weapons capable of rendering Earth into molten ruin. From the bridge of the Eclipse of Dominion, High Warlord Varzathan watched as his forces swept past the gas giants. The primitive Terran outposts stationed on Jupiter's moons were obliterated in moments, their defenses crumbling under the sheer might of the Dominion's firepower. "Resistance is weak," one of his officers reported. "Terran forces are retreating toward Mars." Varzathan exhaled in amusement. "Good," he murmured. "Let them run. Let them feel powerless before us." But as his fleet pushed deeper into the system, an uneasy sensation crawled at the edges of his mind. Something was off. The humans were fighting back, yes, but not the way he expected. They weren't making a final stand at Jupiter or Mars. They weren't throwing their full fleet into a desperate last-ditch battle. Instead, they were withdrawing in an orderly, calculated fashion, skirmishing just enough to slow the Arathax advance before falling back again. Varzathan's eyes narrowed. They weren't retreating. They were luring him in. On the dark side of the moon, deep within the concealed command center of Lunar Defense Station Aegis, Admiral Elias Vance stood with his arms crossed, watching the battle unfold in real time. The Arathax were doing exactly what he needed them to do. Captain Monroe stood beside him, scanning the tactical readout. "They're pushing hard," she said. "We've lost the outer listening posts. Some of our outposts in the asteroid belt have gone dark." "Acceptable losses," Vance replied coolly. His eyes locked onto the massive red cluster representing the enemy fleet. "They're too focused on the chase. They think we're running." Monroe nodded. "And when they get too close?" Vance's lips curled into a grim smile. "We shut the door." Hours later, the Arathax reached Earth's orbit. The planet was before them now, bathed in blue and green, its cities glimmering like jewels in the darkness of space. The homeworld of humanity, the prize. Varzathan stared at it, a slow smirk forming on his face. "It's over," he declared. "Begin orbital bombardment preparations. We burn this world to ash." The command deck erupted into activity. Orders were issued, targeting systems locked onto key cities: New York, London, Beijing, Moscow. Within minutes, the fleet would rain fire down upon them. Then, the alarms screamed. "What is this?" an officer barked. Varzathan turned sharply toward the tactical display, his eyes widening as hundreds of Terran warships erupted from hidden positions behind the Moon, Mars, and deep space beyond Pluto. They hadn't been retreating. They had been lying in wait. "Impossible!" someone shouted. A new voice cut through the bridge, deep and cold. "Varzathan." The holoscreen flickered, and suddenly Admiral Elias Vance was staring straight at the Arathax warlord. "You walked right into it." The human fleet opened fire. The battle for Earth had begun. The void of space ignited with the fury of 1,000 suns. The moment the trap was sprung, humanity struck with merciless precision. From behind the Moon, from the depths of Mars, from the shadows of deep space, warships surged forward, their weapons unleashed in a cataclysm of fire and destruction. Arathax warships, caught in tight battle formations, were torn apart before they could react. Mass drivers, railguns, and plasma lances ripped through their thick hulls like they were made of paper. Swarms of Terran starfighters darted through the chaos, slipping between enemy defenses and delivering payloads of hyperkinetic rounds directly into weak points. Admiral Elias Vance watched from the bridge of the Indomitable, his expression stone cold as the battlefield unfolded. "They're trying to reposition," Captain Monroe said, her fingers dancing across the holomap. "We hit them too fast. They're scrambling." "Not fast enough," Vance replied. "Keep the pressure on. No mercy." On the battlefield, the Arathax fleet reeled. High Warlord Varzathan bared his fangs as the eclipse of Dominion shuddered violently, sparks flying across the command deck. "Report!" he roared. "Multiple capital ships destroyed. We're being flanked. The humans, they were waiting for us." Varzathan's mind raced. This was not the desperate defense of a dying species. This was a counteroffensive, one planned with chilling precision. "We underestimated them," he growled, gripping the railing. "We thought them weak. That was our mistake." But mistakes could be corrected. "Pull back the second and third battle groups," he ordered. "Regroup and push forward. Crush their flanks. Break their encirclement." His warlords hesitated. "But High Warlord, our retreat is cut off." A slow, sinking feeling settled in Varzathan's gut. He turned to the tactical display. Humanity's fleet had maneuvered around them with terrifying speed. Their retreat routes were gone. Their forces were surrounded. The realization hit him like a hammer. This wasn't just a battle. This was an execution. Across the battlefield, Terran warships pressed the attack, giving no quarter. Aboard the Indomitable, Vance watched as the enemy fleet faltered. Their formations broke. Their ships fired wildly, desperately trying to carve an escape route that no longer existed. "This is it," Monroe said. "They're finished." Vance nodded. He activated the fleet-wide comms. "All ships, engage at will." A final wave of missile salvos and railgun volleys slammed into the Dominion fleet. The massive Arathax battleships, once symbols of their unstoppable empire, were torn apart one by one, reduced to drifting wreckage in the void. Varzathan's flagship, the Eclipse of Dominion, was the last to fall. As its burning hull spiraled toward Earth's atmosphere, its final transmission echoed through the darkness. "We should have killed them before they became a threat." Then, with a final explosion, the last remnants of the Arathax invasion fleet ceased to exist. Humanity had won, and the galaxy would never underestimate them again. The wreckage of the Arathax fleet drifted lifelessly in the void, a silent graveyard of twisted metal and shattered warships. The once mighty Armada that had come to erase humanity had been utterly destroyed. On Earth, cheers erupted across every city, every bunker, every military command center. People poured into the streets, waving flags, embracing strangers, crying tears of relief and victory. From the underground war rooms of Geneva to the orbital stations that had barely survived the initial skirmishes, the message was the same. Humanity had won. But on the bridge of the indomitable, Admiral Elias Vance was not celebrating. He stood motionless, watching the tactical screen, his mind still processing what had just happened. The Dominion was powerful, ruthless, unforgiving, and now they had suffered the worst defeat in their history. Captain Monroe approached cautiously. "Sir, the battle is over. We did it." Vance exhaled, his jaw tightening. "No," he said quietly. "We won a battle. The war is just beginning." Monroe frowned. "You think they'll come back?" Vance turned to her, his expression grim. "We just humiliated one of the strongest empires in the galaxy. They won't let this stand." He glanced at the wreckage of the Aerathax fleet. "Next time," he said, "they won't just send an invasion force." He met Monroe's eyes. "They'll send everything." Far beyond the Saul system, on the Dominion homeworld of Zarkon, the news of the catastrophe had reached the throne room of the Aerathax High Council. The room was vast, dark, and lined with towering banners of past conquests. At its center sat the Primark of Dominion, the supreme ruler of the Aerathax. His 6 golden eyes glowed dimly as he listened to the trembling voice of the warlord who had survived the battle. They fought like no species we have ever faced," the warlord stammered. "Their strategies, their ferocity. It was as if they knew every move we would make before we made it." The Primarch's claws tapped against his stone throne. "And what became of High Warlord Varzathan?" The warlord hesitated. Then, bowing his head, he spoke. "Dead, my lord. His fleet, gone." Silence. The gathered warlords shifted uneasily, awaiting the Primarch's reaction. Then, slowly, the ruler of the Aerathax Dominion rose from his throne. His towering form cast a shadow across the chamber, his presence suffocating, his aura of power undeniable. For centuries, no species had dared to stand against the Dominion. But now, humanity had shattered that illusion. "They thought no one would come to their aid," the Primarch said, his voice like distant thunder. "They believed they were alone. But when we came to conquer," his 6 golden eyes burned brighter. "Earth's mightiest Armada arrived." His claws clenched into fists. "Very well. If it is war they desire—" He turned to his gathered warlords, his voice a whisper that rumbled through the chamber like a storm. "Then we shall bring them extinction." The war for humanity's survival had only just begun. The celebrations on Earth lasted for days, but Admiral Elias Vance had no time to indulge in victory. He knew the war was far from over. Inside the United Terran Command Center, deep beneath Geneva, holographic displays flickered with disturbing intelligence. Reports from long-range probes and deep space scouts told a terrifying story. The Aerathax Dominion was moving. "We've intercepted their transmissions," said Lieutenant Kaito, the head of Terran intelligence. "The Dominion High Council is furious. They've declared us a cosmic infestation that must be eradicated." Vance folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "What are we looking at?" Kaito tapped a command on the holotable. A new fleet materialized in the projection. It was like nothing they had seen before. "The Dominion isn't just sending another invasion force," Kaito said grimly. "They're mobilizing their entire war machine." The room fell silent. Hundreds, no thousands of warships, far beyond what humanity had just fought off. Dreadnoughts the size of cities. Siege platforms capable of obliterating entire continents. weapons so advanced that even the best minds in the Saul system could barely comprehend them. This is a full-scale eradication campaign, said Captain Monroe. They don't just want to conquer us anymore, they want us gone. Vance's jaw tightened. He had expected retaliation. He had expected vengeance. But this was genocide in the making. President Alan Graves, standing at the head of the room, took a deep breath. What are our options? Vance's voice was low but firm. We fight. Graves narrowed his eyes. Can we win? Vance turned back to the holomap. The odds were impossible. 3,000 Dominion warships against the battered remnants of Earth's fleet. And yet, when he looked at the faces around the table, he saw no fear, only defiance. He exhaled. We don't need to win, he said. We just need to make them regret coming. Across the galaxy, the largest armada in Arathak's history began its march toward Earth. At its helm, aboard the Harbinger of Extinction, stood the Primark of the Dominion himself. He gazed at the distant stars, his 6 golden eyes filled with cold fury. Let the humans gather their fleet, he murmured. Let them believe they have hope. His claws flexed. This time we do not stop until their world burns to its core. And so the final war for humanity's survival began. The storm of war came faster than anyone had predicted. Within weeks, the Dominion's apocalyptic fleet surged toward the Saul system. The vastness of their numbers was beyond anything humanity had faced before. 3,000 warships, siege platforms capable of turning planets to molten wastelands, swarms of hunter-killers designed to seek out and eliminate survivors. Against them stood Earth's last line of defense. The United Terran Armada, battered but unbroken, assembled at the edge of the system. Every remaining warship, every station-mounted cannon, every last defensive satellite was turned toward the incoming storm. Even civilian freighters had been retrofitted with makeshift weapons. The people of Earth did not run. They did not beg for mercy. They stood. The Battle of Saul was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Dominion came with overwhelming force, but the Terran fleet fought like demons. Human warships, outnumbered and outgunned, executed daring maneuvers that defied all logic. Fleets of AI-controlled drones filled the void, slamming into Dominion vessels with terrifying precision. Orbital platforms rained nuclear fire onto the approaching enemy. And when the Dominion breached Mars' defense line, humanity deployed its final weapon. The Thanatos Protocol. Experimental dark matter warheads, forbidden by interstellar law, were detonated within the heart of the enemy fleet. Reality itself seemed to tear apart as gravitational distortions shredded hundreds of Arathak's warships. But even that was not enough. The Dominion pushed forward. They shattered Earth's first line of defense. They broke past Mars. They reached Earth's orbit, and then humanity did what it always did best. It adapted. Using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and desperate last stands, human forces fought on. Even when the orbital stations fell, even when the space docks were turned to rubble, humanity refused to surrender. Then, in one final act of defiance, Admiral Elias Vance led a suicide strike against the Harbinger of Extinction, the flagship of the Dominion Primark himself. With his last breath, Vance detonated the Indomitable's reactor, taking the Arathak's leader with him. The Dominion fleet, leaderless and bleeding, hesitated, and humanity seized the moment. From hidden bunkers on Earth, from the last surviving warships, from the depths of the asteroid belt, humanity struck back with everything they had left. The once invincible Arathaks broke, and when the remnants of their fleet fled, humanity did not pursue them. They simply watched. Watched as the Dominion, the once great conquerors of the galaxy, ran from the species they had sought to destroy. Years later, the scars of war still remained. Earth had been battered, but it endured. The Dominion, once the greatest power in the galaxy, had never recovered from their defeat. Other alien civilizations, once too afraid to challenge them, rose up in rebellion. The empire that had terrorized the stars for centuries began to crumble. Humanity had not just survived. They had changed the fate of the galaxy forever. And so, when future generations looked to the stars, they did not see darkness. They saw a future they had won with blood and fire. Because when the universe came to erase them, when the Dominion believed Earth would stand alone, when all hope seemed lost, Earth's mightiest armada arrived.